we invite you for the breakout session. Upgrading democracy. What can we learn from populism? What are the roots of populism in Western democracies? What are the shortcomings of the liberal democratic system? How can we reform democracy without compromising on its very foundations?
Thanks to the organizers very much for inviting me to be here. Really happy to have an opportunity to talk with you about some of the survey research that we've done at Pew around the world in terms of views towards democracy and populism. And I think one of the key takeaways we've had in our research is that democracy is an idea that has a lot of appeal around the world. But often, commitment to democracy is not especially deep. And that lack of commitment can open up political space for certain forms of populism to grow. So what I'll do is walk through a few slides. If we can pull the slide presentation up there, thank you, that highlight some of the key findings we've had in our surveys in terms of views about democracy and populism. And I'll start off with a survey that we conducted in 38 countries around the world last year, including 10 EU nations. And in that study, what we wanted to do was to better understand how people view representative democracy and alternatives to representative democracy. And I'll start off with the good news, which is that representative democracy is a popular idea around the world. So if you look across these 38 nations that we surveyed, you find that a median of 78% said representative democracy is a good way to govern. So that's good news. There's also some bad news in parts of the survey as well, including the fact that people aren't really satisfied with the way representative democracy is working in their countries. Across these 38 countries, you found that 52% said they were dissatisfied with the way democracy is functioning in their nations. Another thing we found is that there's a fair amount of support for alternatives to representative democracy, including the idea of direct democracy. So again, looking across all 38 countries in our survey, we found that 66% said a system in which average citizens vote on major laws rather than elected officials is a good way to govern. And I think you see direct democracy as an increasingly interesting idea to many people in many countries around the world. You see it reflected in the platforms of populist parties and movements in many countries. You see it reflected in the calls for more referenda in certain nations. I think you see it in a variety of different ways in terms of people wanting a more direct voice in the political decision-making of their countries. So direct democracy is an idea that has a lot of appeal in Europe and around the world. The idea of rule by experts rather than rule by elected officials also has some support around the world. About half of those we surveyed said this could be a good way to govern. A sort of strong leader model is less appealing. Still, you had 26%, about a quarter of those we surveyed, saying they think that a system in which you have a strong leader who doesn't have to bother with parliaments or courts could be a good way to govern their country. And then the least popular option we gave people was military rule. But even here, you do get about a quarter saying that this could be a good option. And you see a surprisingly high number of people in many countries we might think of as consolidated democracies saying military rule could be a good option. in the United States, in Italy, in France. In all three of those countries, 17% say that military rule could be a good way of governing. And that's a pretty shocking finding for a lot of Americans, saying that nearly 1 in 5 Americans are open to this option, but it's consistent with what other surveys have shown as well. So representative democracy is an idea that people like, but they're not necessarily happy with how it's working, and they're open to alternatives in many cases. Another thing we see is that there's a link between views on the economy and views about representative democracy. What this slide highlights is that people who think the next generation is going to be worse off financially than their parents are less supportive of representative democracy. So if you want to take Poland as the example here, the third row, if you look at the list of countries there, among Poles who think the next generation is going to be better off than their parents, 84% of those people say representative democracy is a good way to govern. Among those who think the next generation is going to be worse off, it's just 70%. And we see the same kind of relationship in many of the other countries that we surveyed in. So economic pessimism about the long term is linked to a lack of support, or at least less support, for representative democracy. So there's an economic component. There's also a sort of cultural or social component as well. And you can see that here in this slide. This slide highlights the fact that people who think that racial, ethnic, and religious diversity in their country makes their country a worse place to live are less supportive of representative democracy. So take the U.S. as the example this time, again, the third country down on the list. Among Americans who think diversity makes the U.S. a better place, 88% say representative democracy is a good thing. It's just 71% among those who say that diversity makes the U.S. a worse place to live. And again, the same relationship found in many of the other countries in our survey. So there's an economic component when you're talking about views towards democracy. There's a cultural or social component. And then I think there's also a purely political component as well. If you're looking at this lack of commitment to representative democracy, if you're looking at the rise of populism in many countries, you've got to look at this view that many people have that political elites are out of touch, and the distrust they have in many political institutions. And I'll show you a couple of slides that highlight that. This data is from a survey we conducted in 8 European countries late last year. And we asked people, which comes closer to your view? Most elected officials care what people like me think, or most elected officials don't care what people like me think. And as you can see, with a couple of exceptions, Sweden and Denmark, majorities in these countries tend to say that most elected officials don't really care what people like me think. And you get pretty substantial majorities in many nations. In Italy and Spain, for example, it's roughly 8 in 10 who hold this view. And we see this kind of result on many of the questions we ask. Question after question, you see people expressing the view that political elites in one way or another are out of touch with ordinary citizens and don't really listen to ordinary citizens. Now, we often see that these kind of views are particularly common among people who support populist parties and movements. You can see that a little bit here on this slide. This is data from a question where we ask people whether they trust or whether they don't trust their national government to do what is right for the country. And if you look at, and there's differences between people according to whether they have positive or negative views of populist parties. So if you take Germany as an example, among people who have a favorable view of AfD, 65% of those people do not trust the government to do what's in the country's interest. It's just 24% among people with a negative view of AfD. And you see the same kind of pattern in many of the countries in Europe where we ask this question. So it's the supporters of populist parties who are overwhelmingly more likely to say they don't trust the national government. And then one final slide I wanted to review with you highlights a sort of pattern that we see in lots of different ways in our data, which is that views towards one type of institution are often related towards views towards other types of institutions. So what this slide highlights is that there's a strong relationship between trust in government on the one hand and views about the media on the other hand. So if you look at the horizontal axis of this scatter plot here, that shows you the percentage of people in each country we surveyed last year who say they trust the national government to do what's right for the country. The vertical axis is the percentage of people in each country we surveyed who say that they are satisfied with the job the national media is doing. And there's a very strong correlation between these two things, almost a 0.9 correlation. And this highlights a pattern that, again, we see again and again. When you see positive views towards political institutions, you often see positive views towards other types of institutions. When you see a lack of trust in political institutions, you also see a lack of trust in other types of institutions as well, like the media, like financial institutions, and so on. So this distrust of institutions kind of hangs together in coherent patterns. And I'll leave it there. I'll just note that these are some of the public opinion dynamics that I think we see around the world, and often especially in Europe, that create conditions that can give rise to populism and where populist parties and movements can grow. And I'll just put a quick plug in. We have lots of additional data on this at Pew, and we go into much more detail about all of this data in a recent piece that a colleague and I wrote for Journal of Democracy, where we try to make the case that if you look at public opinion around the world at least, there's a sort of a crisis of confidence in liberal democracy being driven by some of these economic, social, and political factors that we've touched on just briefly here today. And I'll stop there, and I look forward to hearing the panel discussion. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Richard, for this excellent point of departure for our debate, outlining precisely the link between economic pessimism and distrust in representative democracy, the cultural components, the anti-elitism, and the linkage between distrust of government and media. So I would now like to ask to the stage Teresa Fallon, who is the director of the Center for Russia, Europe, and Asia Studies, based in Brussels, Belgium. Teresa, welcome. Next, David Kramer, who is a senior fellow at the McCain Institute and former U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor from the United States. Zsuzsanna Szeleny, non-resident fellow at the Institute for Human Sciences in Austria, Institut für die Wissenschaft vom Menschen. It sounds almost better in German than in English. And a former member of the Hungarian Parliament. And last but by no means least, we have two gentlemen. We have Konrad Szymański, who is the Secretary of State in the Polish Ministry of Foreign Affairs, responsible for European Union questions. And we have Nicolas Tenzer from France, who is the chair of the Centre d'études et de réflexion pour l'action politique in France, which is intranslatable, basically. But it's Nicolas is an expert in questions of populism and also Russian influence, and we're going to come to that later on. I might also add that I myself am policy director of the Martin Center for European Studies, which is a proud cooperation partner of the Warsaw Security Forum. So, without further ado, I would like to start with the Polish minister in our, on our panel here. And Panie Ministrze, I would like to ask you about the fact that Poland's government today is often called populist by other governments or other Europeans on this continent, and what the Polish government has characterized in its slogan as dobra zmiana, change for the better, is actually seen as niedobra zmiana by many other Europeans. In other words, change for the worse. So could you give us in a couple of minutes, in a nutshell, the difference between how the Polish government is governing and what other governments in Europe are doing? Why is there so much tension in Europe? Panie Ministrze, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I think first I should defend the civility and credibility of the European political process. No one EU government would blame us as a populist. But I notice the frequently quoted opinion made rather by commentators or independent or not so much independent think tankers that they repeat time to time that the dobra zmiana is a rather populist change, which is not very relevant. It doesn't clarify too much, doesn't explain too much about the nature of the political change in Poland. I think the Pew research already presented to us shows us something very important. Poland and Poles are among those who still believe that the next generation will be better off, which proves that the change is for better, not for worse, which is a very important aspect of political assessment. But the major paradox here in this discussion about populism is the fact that we have a profound question mark in almost every single member state in the EU about the future of the European integration, about the future of the Eurozone integration, sometimes quite strong, supported by 30, 40% of the people. You can find this question mark and hold the breath during the electoral campaigns in many, many countries, including founding member of the European Union, but not in Central Europe. We should remember about it because what Central Europe has in offer to the rest of Europe is economic growth, sustainable social model, contribution to the overall European growth, political stability, and support for the European integration, defense integration in NATO, international order, and free trade, which is still a majority point in Europe, but I think we miss something. And I would agree that the general change in Europe is rather negative, but it's not about Central Europe. This is the most important paradox. In the same time, it's so much easier to blame Central Europe for being populist. This is a big question. How could it be with these strong facts behind our politics? I'm afraid, and this is not the EU government position, it's my personal suspicion or personal remark, that even after 15 years, after a great expansion of the European Union, great enlargement with strategic consequences for Europe and for our security, even after 15 years, still quite substantial part of the political class, especially distressed by the crisis, probably it has a psychological role here, quite a number of people in Western political class would prefer to see us, Central European member states, as accession countries. It is so comfortable to be a member of the European Union and have accession countries on the other side of the table that you can't forget it, probably. It is one of the most important problems we have here because we are a member for 15 years and we would like to celebrate the European unity, of course. It is a value here. But we even more would like to create a political substance of European Union because the accession process is no longer valid. It's no longer relevant. The accession is finished in 2003 and 2004, and we can't accept any kind of comeback to the accession logic when the one-sided alignment to someone else's norms is the nature of the political process, is no longer valid. And I think here we have a psychological problem behind this unproportional bias to Central Europe.
That begs a follow-up question, Minister. Anyone among the defenders of liberal democracy, which, by the way, is a term that we should introduce into this debate. It's not only about representative democracy, it's also about checks and balances. So anyone who defends checks and balances would answer, well, the Central European member states entered in 2004, they signed basic values to which they have to adhere as members of the European Union. They also signed up to certain procedures, how these values are going to be implemented. So do I hear a note of complaint against some West European moral imperialism by sticking to the treaties?
No, it's not about sticking to the treaties. It's about the narrative we hear among commentators, among the think tankers and commentariat in general terms. I don't know any single Polish politician, and to be honest, probably I don't know any single Czech, Estonian, or Croatian politician which wouldn't subscribe fully to the catalogue of values in Article 2 of the treaty. It is not controversial. The values are not controversial here. What is controversial is implementation of values. And here we have a great time of change because the correlation, proportions between, for example, freedom and equality is a constant problem in historical development of liberalism itself. If you remember the liberal tradition since the very beginning of Mill, you will understand very easily that there is no one standard liberal or liberal democratic society. You have constant evolution. And probably for today's challenges we have right now on the table, we need an adaptation and constant evolution for the future. Otherwise, you will end up in a quite defensive position in defense of ancien regime, quite reactionary, by the way. It's not very usual for liberal tradition. And I'm afraid you will lose this ground, as it was presented in the Pew Research, to even greater proportion, which would be a pity because in the end, we have a risk with the whole system, which is, for example, European Union. We would like to preserve this system. That's why we recommend an adaptation, not defensive, exclusive, blaming and shaming.
Okay, thank you very much. I'd like to turn to the other Central European on our panel, Zsuzsa Szeleny. Can I ask you, is the question of liberal democracy versus illiberalism an East-West conflict, or are the things more complicated? Would you subscribe to what Minister Szymański has just said? Or
Thank you very much for the question. It's really a very interesting issue, and I'd like to quote someone for you, and I wonder whether you can guess who said this. This was told in 2014, so 4 years ago, in Europe. Hungary has had the courage to rebel against Brussels, and now it's developing. Why shouldn't we do this as well? I wonder whether you have any idea who said this 4 years ago, but it was Matteo Salvini, who was following Viktor Orban 4 years ago as a hero who was rebelling against Europe and developing. And then, of course, we saw him rebelling against Brussels since then and developing. And I think I would like to start with this comment because, of course, this is, I want to put on the table the issue of East and West and what is possible and who follows whom. And well, there was a lot of talk about, and I think quite a common understanding about why we are here and why this basic distrust of liberal democratic values and representative democracy is there all over the world and specifically in Europe. I would like to introduce the term of sovereignist politics, because this is what is now seen to be a trend, more than a trend, a revolution in Europe. At least a number of European politicians believe there is a sovereignist revolution going on, which can take back a larger level of sovereignty to European member states. And I think this is very present now in the election year of the European Parliament. Sovereignists, we can call them illiberals or populists, many other ways, but I use sovereignists because this is how they quote themselves. obviously leading example is Hungarian government with Viktor Orban. They call for freedom of action. This is what sovereignism is for them. But we also have to see, and then we can see it in detail in Hungary, that this kind of sovereignism is also deeply questioning the relationship between liberal democracy, human rights, and the rule of law, and the European Union. So sovereign, and they don't like to speak about openly, but they are actually questioning whether the European Union stands on the basics of democracy, rule of law, and human rights. Maybe this is something which is called someone else's logic. I'm not sure. I definitely do not agree with this. But there is this very central element of the concept. And of course, this is the big problem, that the EU logic and Central European countries are very pro-European, and they know they have to be because there is no any other future for this region. I mean, we've heard Norman Davies earlier speaking. So there's no any other choice for us in history and future. But what kind of Europe this is it? Is this other people's rules, or this is on our own, which might be an illiberal, non-democratic, where we don't respect rule of law? And then this is where Matteo Salvini comes in, because of course he's not an Eastern European. He's from Italy, from founding member of the European Union, and he believes also that questioning the rules of the EU, basically with anything, is how politicians should behave and develop. And I think then we are really at the very core of the problems. I believe sovereignists are very often hackers of the European Union, hacking the EU, like Nigel Farage was hacking the EU, sitting in the European Parliament for many years and taking the salary, and then continually working on Britain withdrawing from the EU. I mean, this is quite a nonsense, and I just can't emphasize that we should not forget this is not only in Central and Eastern Europe. There are European Union hackers who are undermining the unity of the EU, and basically, maybe not Farage, but in Central and Eastern Europe, many politicians do question liberal democratic basics of the European Union, and I think then we are in trouble.
Yeah, Zsuzsa, thank you very much. I mean, I also sometimes wonder what would happen if other countries started hacking the EU. For example, you could make a town hall meeting in Germany and ask the question, do you want to continue to let Brussels bureaucrats take money out of your pocket and give it to the Southerners or the people in the East? You could ask the question, do you want bureaucrats or your national elites to let in migrants against your will, and so on and so on? You could have a very quick process of indeed many people hacking the EU. Now, David, I want to make the jump across the Atlantic Ocean and ask you, what does Trump have to do, and his victory and his evident success, at least in taking over the Republican Party, have to do with the phenomena that we described in Europe, sovereignism, national populism? How much parallels and how many differences are there between what's happening in the US and in Europe?
Thanks, Roland. I think there are a lot of similarities, and I think Donald Trump as a candidate tapped into a number of populist streaks that were prevalent in the United States. His stress on sovereignty at his UN General Assembly speech last month strikes a chord because he's stressing to others, we will do what we want to do in the United States, it's none of your business. At the same time, he's flipping that around and saying, you can also do what you want to do, we're not going to lecture you. Which I think is a distortion of what the United States has done when it comes to democracy and human rights around the world. He taps into the issue of immigration, which is a neuralgic issue, of course, in Europe. It has become one in the United States, where he is both talking about threats that could come from people trying to enter the United States, other immigrants stealing jobs from Americans, so he's using this issue as well. He talks about inequality and how certain segments of the population have been neglected as a result of government policies over the years. He uses the issue of protectionism to say that the United States, under his administration, is going to undo the worst trade deals that have ever been signed, whether it's NAFTA, TPP, or anything else, and how he is going to right the trade deficits that have been inherent in his mind in these trade deals. He talks about the courts, how he wants the courts to take a position that is consistent with the conservative streak in the Republican Party. He talks about deregulation, to get government out of the affairs of citizens to allow them to go on with their lives. But in doing all of these things, he taps into fear, a strong sense of fear, whether it's from immigrants, people who look different than white Americans. He taps into racism, where he sows divisions in the United States by weighing in on issues, whether it's about the protests with our professional football players or other things of that sort. And just this week, he has described himself as a nationalist. He clarified and said he's not a white nationalist, but a nationalist. He says things that no other president has said before, at least in recent history, and he touches on issues that maybe other presidents have tried to touch on, but he does it in a way that no other president has done. And so he is clearly appealing to his base, which has remained consistent. And I think it is fair to say, as he bragged during the campaign in 2016, he could go down Fifth Avenue in New York City and shoot someone, and his base would still stand with him.
Does his base also stand with him in the bromance with Putin that allegedly he much prefers to compared to his advisors and other political forces in Washington? So what is happening? To what extent is Russian meddling playing a role in populism in the West?
The views among people in the Republican Party have changed. The Republican Party has become the softer party when it comes to dealing with Mr. Putin, and the Democratic Party has become more of the hawkish party. So we have almost not a complete reversal. In the U.S. Congress, there is bipartisan support for a tougher policy dealing with Mr. Putin. Within Donald Trump's administration, there is consensus for a tougher policy toward dealing with Mr. Putin. If you look at the Vice President, if you look at the UN Ambassador, Secretary Pompeo, Secretary Mattis, and others, they have been very tough. There have been sanctions that have been maintained, even increased, lethal assistance being provided to Ukraine and Georgia, and increase in U.S. military presence in the region. That's on one side, and then over here is the President, who refuses to criticize Mr. Putin, dismisses the notion of Russian interference in the election, talks instead about Chinese interference in the last election. And you have, at the same time, Mr. Bolton in Moscow just yesterday dismissing the impact of Russian interference in the U.S. election. There is a complete disconnect between the actions, I'm reluctant to use the word policy, the actions of the administration on the one hand, and everything Mr. Trump says on the other. And it is confusing. And it is difficult, as people in the administration and defenders of the president would argue, focus on the actions, not on the rhetoric. You can't dismiss what the President of the United States says. He is, with all due respect to other countries around the world, the most powerful person in the world. His tweets are actually our official statements. And he can undo these actions over here through one tweet, one statement, or one upcoming meeting with Mr. Putin.
Thanks, David. I'd like to stay with the Putin factor, but move back to Europe now with Nicolas Tenzer. And Nicolas, I'd like to ask you, I mean, what are the most spectacular examples of Russian meddling in the European Union, and what do populist, nationalist, sovereignist parties have to do with that?
We have to really understand what's the real factors that play a role in Russian propaganda, and how Russian propaganda doesn't, in fact, create the populism, but in fact is fueling populism for obvious reasons. And I would say that basically populism is a Putinism for many different reasons. First of all, if we try to define what is populism, I would say that populism is trying to attract the people through their worst instincts. Selfishness, closed-mindedness, propensity to believe the people who are saying the more, I will say, easiest thing to not to understand, but to believe. And I think that Putinism is in fact exactly the same things. What Putinism is trying to fuel in the European democracies, but also in the US democracy and in other democracies around the world, is that there is no major distinctions between truth and lie, that the confusions of the mind is probably the best way to dominate the people, that historical truth doesn't matter, that nationalism is probably the best way to put the country together, because then those countries will try to oppose other countries, and then at the end of the day it will destroy Europe. And I think that if we consider how Putin is playing with populism, it's true the very simple fact that Putin is in reality is in a sort of Kulturkampf mood. I think that Kulturkampf, as the Germans say, is probably the best characterizations of Putin's view. Of course, there are different tactics in Russian propaganda. You have all the untrue narrative, all the lies on Ukraine, on Skripal, on Syria. You have all the propaganda that you well know, just trying to hide the facts. But in fact, in Putin's propaganda, you have a lot of things that we can very well observe in all the Putin websites or Twitter account or Facebook accounts, which is how we can fuel everything that create resentment, dissatisfaction. It was very clear in the Pew research. And in fact, it creates a kind of subversion. Subversion through what? Showing that the people, in fact, distrust the government, distrust the elite, distrust the media. Not saying that it, of course, Putin has created this distrust. But when you have this distrust, it's very easy for Russian propaganda to fuel it through other stories. And creating a lot of buzz, as we say, a lot of news stories about the reasons for which the people have not to put their confidence in the elite, in the media, etc. And it's very interesting to see that working in countries like Italy, for instance, but also in my country, France. If you see all the people, especially the so-called populist party, either from the far right or for the radical left, but that's exactly the same. They are against Europe, they are pro-Russian, pro-Assad, against the medias, against the elite, against the euro, and they are trying to say that we are the true people that must win at the end of the day. And if we consider this Kulturkampf, I think we have to understand that all the countries, even if they try to stand up to Russia's aggression, if they are just pasting all the narrative of Russia propaganda, like, for instance, the fault of the media, the problem of the sometimes anti-Semitism, the attempt of the judiciary to dominate the powers, these kind of things, then in fact, Putin will be the winner at the end of the day. Because there will be no arguments for European countries only trying to contradict Putin on the military side if they are not able to contradict Putin on the, I will say, ideological side. That's, I think, the most important thing, just to understand, you know, in Europe today.
Thank you, Nicolas. I think this is really important to keep in mind. The parties in the European Union can actually be helping Putin without openly being in cahoots with Putin. That's very important. Teresa, turning to you now. You're a specialist on Russia, Eurasia, China. We've heard many admiring words about China from some of Europe's populists recently. Authoritarianism, of the Chinese style seems to be en vogue. What's the difference between China's ways of impacting liberal democracy and Russia's methods of meddling? Is there Chinese meddling, and how does it differ from the Russian?
Thank you very much, Roland, for that great question. And I just want to say thank you to the organizers for the invitation and to be on this esteemed panel. Just to give you a little anecdote to start this off. You know, the Chinese always say we don't do interference, but even now Chinese officials will say, well, we have a kind of a cafeteria approach. We pick and choose from the buffet what we want to do, and they do obviously interfere, but they do it in a very subtle way. I was at the Gala Chinese New Year event at the Chinese embassy in Brussels, and they invited a Belgian populist party leader to speak. And this is the year of EU-China tourism. So this man got up and addressed the crowd, and there were some Belgians standing behind me kind of murmuring, like, why is he here? Why is he invited to speak? And he started talking about the year of EU-China terrorism. And he said it 3 times. Each time he talked about EU-China terrorism, and I was trying to catch the Chinese out of the corner of my eye, and their faces were just frustrated. And he finally had to say, oh, I just wanted to see if you're really paying attention. I meant tourism. So even when the Chinese try to kind of handpick these populists to speak publicly, sometimes it backfires on them. So I think everyone else was kind of smiling silently to themselves after that experience. So China is very fascinating because they have what we call the 3 warfares, which will, grab everyone's attention. So psychological, media, and legal. And they have increased their budget dramatically to do this. And so Europe is one of their, prime playing fields. And we see Confucius Institutes around Europe, shaping public opinion. I'm sure all of you have seen CCTV, or now it's renamed CGTN, on your television screens, China Daily newspapers, and even, for example, in the US in Iowa, there was a special insert in the newspaper about how Donald Trump's dismal policy towards China is actually hurting the local soybean farmers. So they use the open liberal democracies to plant their information and try to shape opinion. And so, of course, Vice President Pence came out very strongly in regard to that, saying how China was meddling in the election. But if I couple this, the Soviet Union was really kind of the teacher of the Chinese Communist Party. So there we have the 5, what we call the magic weapons. And so China still has improved these and sharpened them. And there are 5 issues. So they seek out government officials to have good relations. We see throughout Europe a lot of impact with Chinese influence on government officials. Businesses, this is a big issue now on how European businesses have to give technology. Universities, so many people here might have heard about the deep pockets of the Chinese. So university students go to China full tuition and study. There's a China Scholar Association, so when Chinese students come to Europe, they're monitored very closely so to make sure they don't make any statements on Tibet, Taiwan, or Tiananmen, the 3 Ts. So these types of ability of China can kind of subvert even when Chinese students study here or European students study in China. And then the Chinese are very patient. They think long-term. Their first foreign political objective is not to make too many enemies. So they kind of go slowly, a soft approach. Their second objective is to learn. They're very good learners. If you've noticed, we've seen the Chinese diplomats speak the local languages, and they're very good at feedback loops and learning from their mistakes. And then lastly, it's to tie the country to their economy. So there have been some mistakes, and we've seen, for example, in Poland with the building of the road. The Chinese won this bid to build a road. Everyone in this room who is from Poland is probably familiar with this. And they assumed they could bring in Chinese workers, but that would be against EU policy regulations. So the low bid that the Chinese won but they couldn't deliver, so it was almost a shame the Chinese had to give up building this road. But they've learned, and they'll get better, and they keep improving their message, and they've got time. I can think of, we're talking about, to pick up on Richard Wieke's presentation on representative democracy. Well, the EU, when I was based in Beijing, they were pouring a lot of money into local democracy programs inside China. Well, we don't see that happening any longer, but the whole idea in China was kind of a subversion of democracy. The idea was you find out what the local people are doing, and you have these kind of like little elections to find out and have your ear to the ground to find out how people really are thinking. And now with big data in China, they don't even care about these programs anymore. They feel that they can gauge, even in the smallest provinces, popular opinion and shape it. So this idea, there was kind of a window dressing about democracy, and the EU taxpayers are actually kind of funding it. So I want to just add China's economic statecraft, which we've heard about with the Belt and Road Initiative. They have been able to do something Russia was never able to do, and that was to buy an EU statement. With the arbitral tribunal decision, July 2016, the EU was expected to support rule of law. And if there's one thing the EU should support is rule of law. But because of certain member states who had the promise of investment from China or actual investment from China, I'm thinking of Greece and Hungary right now, they blocked the statement, watered it down, and the Europeans were only able to acknowledge the International Tribunal. We've also seen Greece block statements by the EU on human rights. And then to conclude, China and Russia are similar in some respects because they both want to see a weakened EU, but China's approach is a little more nuanced because they like the big market, they like being able to invest in Europe, so they like to be able to have some leverage, and they can do this through economic coercion by promising investment. So the Chinese, it's a nuance, they like to be able to call on certain member states to block, for example, the foreign direct investment screening mechanism. And finally, I think China likes Russia so much because it's a huge distraction from what China's really doing in Europe. We've seen a dramatic increase in investments in Europe. And everyone's always talking about Russia, Russia, Russia. And China loves this. And when others start focusing on China, Chinese news statements are almost like, you're missing the point, you should be paying attention to Russia. They don't want anyone to be talking about them. So Russia is a really useful distraction for Chinese investments, and Chinese investments have skyrocketed, and they went from 0 to 10% of European ports. So it's really a dramatic change, and I think we need to remember that. So the magnetism of money, the attraction of the BRI, and embracing China, we have to be careful that if you turn on the news today and listen to the BBC, it's all over the news about the Uyghur. Over 1 million Uyghurs are held in camps, patriotic camps, the Chinese call them. And it's one of the world's biggest prisons. So if we embrace China, are we actually legitimizing what they're doing? So we really have to walk carefully down this route. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Teresa. So we've talked about the intra-EU debate about the rule of law and the future of European integration. We've talked about the transatlantic angle. We've talked about Russia's and China's meddling with the help of populists inside the European Union, inside the West, actually. So before we open it up to the audience, I have this one question to all of you. Please answer with one idea, if possible, in one sentence. So what can we learn from the existence of populism or from what populist parties are doing for the future of our democracies? And I'm starting with Konrad Szymański.
I think this debate is not the only one which proves very well that the concept of populism doesn't explain anything important. It's very low intellectual value behind this concept. It's a propaganda concept, it's a stick, it's a blame, but nothing important. If you want to understand the change of the political situation in Europe, you have to understand the root causes of disappointment. The Eurozone disappointment is different than the migration disappointment. Sometimes it goes together in some countries, and there you can see 40+% of people disappointed by the EU, for example, which is a worrying fact. And it creates a risk and a chance for people like Putin, for sure. But don't reduce the problem of populism to Putin, because it's a short way to close the real debate we need here. Debate about the equality in the society, about the inclusive growth, about competitiveness, single market, migration, identity, community, those things should be addressed also by liberals, by the way, in a proper way, contemporary, proper way. So the answer is adaptation, not blaming.
Interesting concept. Thank you very much. Zsuzsa, what's your take on this?
Okay, I really don't want to learn anything from populists, but of course their presence make us self-reflect, and I think that's very important. And a few things I've understood in Hungarian politics in the last couple of years, and one is that money is not everything. So technocratic politics, when we speak about perspective, it's not all about well-being. I mean, there are other very strong human needs that politics should respond: belonging, loyalty, belief, and I think every successful political enterprise force should take care of this basic human needs.
Thank you. David, what can we learn from Trump? If anything.
Well, let me offer three things. They'll be quick. One is to not take democracy for granted. There is no linear path, and there are no guarantees that countries and societies will pursue democracy if left to their own devices without some guidance. Two, make sure that democracies deliver. The dysfunctionality of democracies, I think, has given populists openings, and at some point we have to make sure that the governments are responsive to their people. And three, clean up our own houses. Putin's greatest export is corruption, but in order to export it, we import it. And so we need to do a much better job of cleaning up our own houses and not leave ourselves exposed and vulnerable to Mr. Putin.
Thank you very much. Nicolas, what's your take?
Well, I think that when the reasons falls asleep, monsters awake. Basically, I mean that we have to pay more attention to, I think, the doctrines, to the doctrinal fight. We have to pay more attention to the narratives behind the very usual political stance. That's the first lesson. The second lesson, if we have to bridge the gap between the people, between the rich and the poor, between the in and the out. We have to reconstruct something like a common feeling, a feeling of community between the people. And that's, of course, maybe the important thing that the populists, in a way, are saying to us, which is not only about Putin, etc., which is the fact that, in fact, you have all the reasons in European democracies, and also in the US and Canada, etc., of a very severe distrust towards the elite. We have to absolutely to address that. And the third lesson is that you have always an interaction between the internal or the domestic politics and the international policy. I mean that we cannot separate the two. And I think that's quite important. Of course, I could elaborate on that.
Thank you, Nicolas. Teresa.
Since everyone's doing three, I'll give three quick points. So there is, we see populism erupting all over the world. We see it in Europe, we see it in the US. So there is something going on. And I mean, it's probably because post-2008, the economic issues. So we really need to focus on the economic issues, economic security, and things are going to get worse before they're going to get better. So, but the EU, I'm based in Brussels, so I kind of see things through an EU lens. So they need to counter the populist message and heed the people's interests. So bubbles Brussels, I mean, I live there. It's always healthy to get out, see what's going on outside the Brussels bubble, and check corruption. I think this is really turning a lot of people off about democracy. And thirdly, Europe now has both Russia and China's influence activities to contend with. I mean, this is very real, and it's eroding people's faith in democracy. So we need a better job, especially on teaching younger people to be critical readers on social media, so they won't fall prey to this kind of propaganda. And, welcome to the new age of complexity. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Teresa. Now, I will give you the opportunity, ladies and gentlemen, to ask a question or even make a short comment, provided that it's short. And I see there's a lady in the fourth row. right here. Would you briefly introduce yourself and then make your point?
My name is Barçın İnanç. I'm a Turkish journalist. I write for the English language Hürriyet Daily News, and I'm coming from a city where a vicious murder of a Saudi journalist has taken place. And when we are wondering about how come, because the Saudis are alleged to have sanctioned the murder, how come the Saudis could dare something like that? And one of the answers is that maybe it was related to the fact that US President Trump has been attacking so much the press, and maybe they thought that they could get away with that. Therefore, maybe this murder could be a turning point, because this has really backfired, it seems to me, in Washington, because it has become a very huge embarrassment, if I'm not mistaken, obviously. But this could be a turning point in terms of, if it goes without any consequence, it will open a new way, and similar murders could take place. But if there is a concentrated pressure, maybe populist governments might decide that, you know, they might slow down on their attack against the press. That was a comment, but anyone who would like to add a view, it's more than welcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Anybody else would like to make a point or ask a question? Yes, there's a gentleman way in the back.
Johannes Ahlefeld, political advisor to the German Social Democrats in Parliament. My question would be, does, let's say, the rise of populism also has got something to do with the digitalization of our communication? And the danger of creating a community, as Nicola suggested, is that with the algorithms, we're increasingly be cordoned in our own worldview and rather reinforced instead of being confronted with other views. And how can we turn this around?
Thank you very much. Anybody else? Yes, right here in the front. Can someone bring a microphone here?
I'm Josh Marevchik from the U.S. I'm struck by an issue that hasn't been discussed, and I wish it would be, which is that the cutting edge of the populist surge in the U.S. as well as most of Europe is the issue of immigration. Coming in Europe at a time when populations are shrinking, not reproducing themselves, and there's a sense of an inability in both the U.S. and Europe to absorb the waves of people from less developed countries who are coming to our shores, and this seems to be the most sensitive issue that populists have seized on to establish themselves electorally, and I wonder what any of our panelists think about solutions to this problem, which is not in and of itself going to disappear.
Thank you very much. Anybody else? Not for the moment. Then I just play back to the panel. And Teresa, why don't you start? Remember, we have these 3 points, immigration, algorithms, and does the Khashoggi case prove that nationalists in the West are encouraging autocrats? So pick one of these.
Okay, I'll pick up Martina's question. I think that was an excellent question. I think that the level of debate is so low, and every morning when I wake up, I think it can't get any lower, and it does get lower. You know, the US president is tweeting to a porn star and calling her a horse face. So I feel that the whole rhetoric has just declined so dramatically, the attack on the press, and also when you were asking this question, what sprang to mind was an example of what happened in Taiwan. I think it was back in 1993, maybe earlier. I don't want to give you the date. John Pomfret recently wrote about that. And something similar happened. A Taiwanese journalist was killed, but it became a turning point because there was such a hue and an outcry. They had reforms, they got rid of martial law, and this person's death actually ushered in democratic change in Taiwan. So that was the silver lining of this horrendous murder. What will happen now? I think the Trump administration, I mean, the very first visit he made was to Saudi Arabia. He put his hands on the orb and everything looked jolly. So I think the Saudis misunderstood that message, or maybe they understood it, and now Donald Trump's administration is a bit shocked about what happened. I mean, to do that in Turkey as well. So the politics of this whole situation, I mean, Erdogan is playing his hand very well, I think, and the fallout of that. So I think the Trump administration from day one, even before the election, he's been talking about fake news and attacking the press. I think the whole population needs to push back on him on that.
Thanks very much, Teresa. Nicola.
First of all, when it comes to human rights, to the protection of the journalist, to the independence of the judiciary, to the response to the crackdown on media, or crackdown on human rights in general, I think we must have an absolutely unambiguous position for many reasons. First of all, because the crackdown on human rights and also civil liberties at home offers a good prediction for aggressive behavior abroad. And in fact, if we consider not only Russia, not only Syria, not only countries like this, but if you consider, for instance, what happened in Saudi Arabia with the inconsistent policy of Saudi Arabia, just now saying, well, okay, I'm okay with Assad. I am okay with all the dictators. That goes along with the fact that, in fact, Saudi Arabia is not a trustable ally anymore. Of course, Iran, probably from a geopolitical point of view, is a danger more important than Saudi Arabia, but we cannot trust, and that goes along with the full disrespect of human rights and principles. When it comes to the questions of, I will say, immigrations that you were mentioning, I think rightly. First of all, I think that the principles of liberal democracy, and I am a liberal, definitely, is that we have to make the people even better than they are. We have to consider that the people are brighter than they are, more clever than they are, more compassionate than they have. We have, in a way, to resist the people. That's the role of the government. And when it comes to migrations, just consider, for instance, the migrations coming and political refugees coming from Syria. We have much more in 3 countries. You have in Jordan, you have in Turkey, you have in Lebanon. Much more. And in fact, the burden of the migrants in Europe is very, very, very tiny. So we have to say the truth to the people, that burden sharing, when it comes to migrations, is possible, and that not a threat to a culture or identity. And I think that we have to have principled government. And that's a shame that we don't have always principled government. So I think that if the government say, okay, that's a threat, must be very cautious about that, not fuel the resentment, etc. What's the policy, it announced for the times to come? Isn't it also playing into, all the dictators' hands, like Putin, who is trying to fragment Europe on migrations issues? I think we have really to think about that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And David?
I would like to think that the murder of Jamal Khashoggi would be similar to what happened in Tunisia when a market vendor set himself on fire and literally ignited the Arab movements. I don't think it will be because of the reaction of the President of the United States, who, while he has condemned the cover-up, doesn't seem to be moved sufficiently to change policy toward dealing with the Saudi kingdom. He is, to my recollection, the first president who has so explicitly stated that arms sales and trade and investment by the Saudis is more important than how the Saudis treat their own people. Saudi Arabia has consistently, for decades, been the major exception to how we handle human rights in U.S. foreign policy. But after this, I don't see any change in President Trump. in his attitude on these issues. He has an affinity for strong men leaders, and they are men, whether it's the kingdom in Saudi Arabia, President in Turkey, President Sisi in Egypt, Duterte in the Philippines, the list goes on and on. And I am very worried that the United States is abdicating its role as a leader on democracy and human rights. We have never been perfect in this role, but it is a role where I do think we are the indispensable power, and we don't seem to share that attitude, at least in the White House anymore. On immigration, just quickly, Josh, I did mention it as part of Trump's appeal to the American electorate. And I think it is important to differentiate between refugees and immigrants, where the United States has sought to be a haven for refugees fleeing for their lives. This caravan that is now moving through Mexico, I fear is a gift to Trump and his supporters. It is coming right before the midterm elections, where it enables him to talk about immigration, which the Democrats don't want to do. And it's playing, I think, into one of his political strengths. But it is unfortunate the way he has handled this issue from day one, when he came down the escalator and was describing Mexicans coming into the United States as rapists and murderers, and others from Latin America. This has become an ugly issue in our politics. It's an issue that needs to be addressed. We don't handle immigration very well, but it's one that is now being exploited more than I've seen before for political gain.
Thank you, David. I'm afraid our organizers have cut the time here a little bit, because, you know, we started late and we're supposed to finish on time. But I do want to give our two remaining panelists the opportunity, seriously, 30 seconds each. Zsuzsa, please.
Okay. There are momentums which move politics ahead, and these murders, just Khashoggi, and also like the Kuciak murder in Slovakia sometime, or the immigration process which hit Europe 3 years ago, or turning points in many ways, because they demonstrate that dysfunction of systems. This is the case in Turkey, in Saudi Arabia, but I think for Turkey is more important, and I just put it in a different context, not in an international, but what Turkish opposition should take out of this. Also, as the Slovak opposition, how they organize themselves, because they realize that even the most kind of decent Central European government, the Slovak, was not okay. So I think there are moments, and everyone who's thinking on politics should catch them, and this should be very, very drastic but motivating moments to actually push positive politics ahead, and this is what I am also encouraging Turkish colleagues.
Thank you. Thank you. Konrad Szymański, one sentence, please.
One sentence, 30 seconds, I would propose. I would like to concentrate on migration, because I think in Europe is one of the vital points. I thank you for that question. We used to believe in Europe that we control our economic processes, including the welfare growth and distribution, and we control a social process, like the migration, including the countries with a huge migration experience, like France. And we lost that feeling, because of different reasons. Sometimes it's a direct experience, like in Germany. Sometimes it's just a perception, like in the UK. Sometimes it is a risk, like in Poland. But in the end, we have a common denominator. We lost feeling of control, or lost control even, over the social landscape, or over the social future of our societies. And our societies has right to protect their future to some degree, in a civilized manner, no doubt. But they have right, the communities have right to project and protect their future. And here we have an answer for the future. We have to find a way how to restore the control and how to reinvent a new consensus about migration, because open border concept is quite new. isn't a necessary part of even liberal tradition. I don't feel a part of this tradition, but I admire that tradition from outside. So I would give you a friendly advice. Adapt to the new situation and restore the control over the process.
Thank you very much. So I'd like to formulate the 3 takeaways from this extremely interesting debate, which covered many aspects. First of all, as the case of Hungarian public opinion about EU institutions shows, you can have, a couple of years ago, the most pro-EU public opinion you want, but consistent government propaganda against the European Union will bear effects. And we're witnessing this in this year's Eurobarometer, which for the first time shows a definite drop in trust into EU institutions in Hungary. Second, adapt. I absolutely take up Minister Szymański's slogan. Adapt, yes, in the sense of taking people's fears seriously, but also stick to the principles on which the European Union and our democracies are built. In other words, the rule of law, checks and balances, liberal democracy, not in the sense of liberal policies, but in the sense of this kind of protection of free media, independent judiciary, and civil society. And third, I'm proud to be sitting in front of 3 flags: the Polish, the European, and the NATO flag. And those of you who have witnessed how the current Polish government announced that it would remove EU flags from public buildings know what I'm talking about. So thank you very much for putting these flags up.
Roland, I'm afraid we have a good example of fake news. It's about digitalization. I don't know what is the source of this information, because you can find the proper EU flag in every building, including my ministry. So don't go too far.
Why did the Prime Minister announce that it was that it would be taken off? I've seen it myself. Thank you very much. Thank you for a great debate.